I'm Robin Morris. For those that don't know me, I'm convener of the Oxford Energy Network. A quick note, we are trying to encourage people to come in the room, and it's great to see so many of you here. But for people online, thanks for joining us. I think we're planning actually for next term to move, so it'll be a streaming rather than an interactive service online. So we just want people in the room to be part of the conversation if at all possible.
And recorded.
And of course, you can always catch up again to catch all the salient points. So we're going to hear from Jeff this evening in your own time via the recordings on the YouTube channel. So this week, we're pleased to welcome Jeff Hardy to talk about a topic that's close to my heart about smart local energy systems. I just had a trawl through Jeff's past. Jeff, having spent the last 6 years or so at the Grantham Institute, Imperial College, but working previously with the IPCC on one of the working groups 3, I think. BEIS and the distribution network operator UK Power Networks, for example, previously at Ofgem, working knowledge exchange at UK Energy Research Centre, and environmental and policy environment and policy manager, at the Royal Society of Chemistry. And that's, I think, the first time I met Jeff.
Yeah.
So obviously singled out for greatness. He was a chemist, but he was invited to join the energy group of the Institute of Physics, co-opted onto the committee, allowing a chemist onto the committee. Imagine that. And then last week, I noticed he popped up. Jeff announced he's engaged with Zinc, as in the Environment Mission Lead, to help nurturing ideas to address the great unmet needs. No challenge here. It has to be a need that will affect at least 100 million people in the developed world, hopefully in a positive way. I didn't see that bit. And where there's unexploited research that has a potential to disrupt. So he'll be doing that just across the food sector with fishing and farming and so on, and transport and the built environment and supply chain. So, no biggie there at all. Good luck with that. But back to this afternoon. So Jeff will be talking about work he's been doing, led by the Grantham Institute at Imperial College as part of the EnergyREV Consortium. Jeff, over to you.
Thank you very much. And good, I'm going to say good, it's not, it's good afternoon, but it really feels like evening already, doesn't it? It's like so dark already. So thank you. Wonderful introduction. I was talking to Sarah earlier over a cup of tea about what it is I do now. And I think, broadly speaking, it's trying to tell everyone else that I'm wearing a different hat so that nobody knows exactly where I'm at any given time, broadly speaking. But, all of the stuff I'm doing ever since my PhD has been around sustainability in one form or another. I am a chemist by training, and I was doing sustainable chemistry. It's like all of my chemistry was about basically substituting fossil fuels for renewable resources. So that's what it was, taking the fossil fuels out of the chemical industry as feedstocks, and also into nutraceuticals and pharmaceuticals as well. But for the last 17 years, yeah, give or take, I've been doing energy policy, energy regulation of one form or another. As a lobbyist, as an academic, inside the tent in Ofgem, in BEIS, in the IPCC to some extent. And now I do everything at the same time. All of my careers are smashed together into some wonderful portfolio, as has just been described. But today I'm wearing my academic hat. And you might wonder why I'm here presenting on my own, but I've got 2 names on here. It's because I want to recognise the work that my colleague Madeline Morris did in all of this work. She was a research associate working with me throughout EnergyREV. She's now following in my trajectory and has gone to Ofgem. So if you're ever interested in what's happening in the innovation link, Maddie is now the most responsible person for all of that. So I didn't put her off during my time as her boss at Imperial. So what am I going to talk about today? I'm going to talk about smart local energy systems. I'm going to tell you right now, I'm not going to define them. You might ask me to, you might plead with me to define them, and I'm not going to, and I'll explain why. But what I'm really going to talk about is some work that me and Maddie did together towards the end of EnergyREV's got another few months to run, but most of the people have left at this point because it's running down into final outputs and that kind of thing at the moment. So this is one of our main bits of work that I'm going to present on today, which was all about what are the most important decisions to enable. let's just call them local energy systems. What are the most important decisions we're going to need to do that? And I'll explain what it was in a minute as I go through. But first, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Energy Revolution Research Consortium so you can understand what that is. Then I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the outputs from that, because basically I'm going to give you the same information I gave the participants in a set of workshops that I ran, so you can agree or disagree with the outputs of that. And then I'm going to tell you what came out of a bunch of workshops to answer that question. So let's talk about the Energy Revolution Research Consortium and Prospering from the Energy Revolution, which I'm sure you all know, and I've already started acronyms and I shouldn't do that in the slides, but anyway. Our research consortium was weird in a good way, because we were a research consortium that was put alongside one of the government's industrial strategy challenge funds, the Prospering from the Energy Revolution. Prospering from the Energy Revolution was all about creating and demonstrating smart local energy systems in real places around the UK. And as you can see there, it was quite a big programme. It was about £100 million of Innovate UK direct government investment into that, or UKRI investment into a series of projects, 4 big demonstrators, 10 detailed design projects. There was also the EnergyREV consortium. That was about a £10 million consortium alongside that to work with, to inform, to learn from those projects and to bring information from elsewhere in the world into them. And then there was a support mechanism run by the Energy Systems Catapult to help them kind of with information about kind of like all sorts of things. You know, how do you do smart? How do you do local? All of that kind of stuff. So really big, on the face of it, integrated program. But like a lot of industrial strategy challenge funds, this thing was thrown together at the speed of light. So basically, it was an exercise to try and shovel out of the door about £1 billion across all of the industrial strategy challenge funds. This one's about 110, 120 all in. So it was one of those things where the scope of it, the speed at which it had to come together, meant that all of the decisions and all of the scope were taken really, really quickly without thinking, for example, what is a smart local energy system, which all of these projects were there to demonstrate. So there was a lot of learning that went on through that program about what is it we're trying to do and what do some of these terms mean. All right, so we've all been through that process together, but we've grown up alongside that set of demonstrators. Really interesting model, hopefully something we might be able to do again, but slightly more thoughtfully in the future. So in terms of the consortium itself, the EnergyREV consortium, basically, it looks like quite a lot of other consortia. I'm looking at Nick there. It's kind of like, he's probably thinking, oh, that's a bit like Creds. It's a bit like you, Kirk. But, you know, these are common horizontal challenges across energy, right? So we designed a consortium that was looking at these cross-cutting issues. So, you know, what does the smart bit mean? Data, artificial intelligence, engineering, cyber physical systems. What are the business models? How are they innovating? How are they attracting investment? The bit that I led on was governance within that. So as you can see, I've got a bit of a history in energy governance in one form or another. Social science insights, go on in, etc. So kind of like, you know, what's happening in the engagement? What are these new structures causing people to do with each other? Inside them, whole systems approach. We all talk about love whole systems, but kind of like taking that whole systems approach, because these are necessarily heat, transport, electricity, behavior all together in a place. And then the wider environment. So are they good for the wider environment? Are they bad for the wider environment? Are they additive? Are they subtractive, etc.? So we were looking at all of this from an interdisciplinary point of view. So I was in work package 3.1 because you know we love work packages and such things. But that was about smart local energy system governance. So that's the team that we put together. Some of you will know Becky Ford because she is a ECI alumni now up at Strathclyde. So Becky wasn't strictly part of my team, but she was so interested in the policy side that we kind of brought her in anyway because she's research director for the whole of EnergyREV, but she's so interested in policy. She kind of like she became an integral part of our team, as you can imagine. And then you can see it's quite an interdisciplinary bunch. You know, we've got me and Maddie, Rachel Bray, some of you'll know from Exeter University. She's now working with Becky up at Strathclyde, about to start a PhD, finally. David Elms from Warwick University, Matt Hannon, Strathclyde, Professor Matt Hannon now, and then Jonathan Radcliffe, It's kind of like, yeah, very young. What a process that he told me about that process as well, that he went through. Wow. Anyway, so that team was all working around this question at the bottom, which is, do we have the appropriate policy, institutional and regulatory frameworks to realise the potential of smart local energy systems? That's the idea behind it. So, you know, it's an academic question, so we expect the answer to be no. And then, of course, the bit that we want to get into, the fun bit, is what should it be? And as you can tell, that is the title of this presentation. How do we enable these smart local energy systems? So over the last 3 and a bit years, this is what we've done. So basically, we started off with, like every other academic project ever, actually, we started off with a load of reviews, which was basically trying to figure out what the baseline is. What is the environment, governance landscape that is faced by smart local energy systems? Where are we at now? What barriers do they face, etc. Then the bit that I'm going to major on at the end of this presentation is kind of like, now that we know where we're at now, where do we need to be? So what decisions are going to best enable smart local energy systems? And we ran a bunch of what we call decision theatres, basically workshops where you lock everyone in until they agree to a set of decisions, online. And then what I want to move into towards the end of this year, a little bit into next year, is how do you implement those changes you need to take? That's what we want to get to. So what's the policy route in there? And I'll tell you briefly another bit of work I'm doing for Innovate UK at the moment, which is basically helping me with that fortuitously as well. So that's the process we've been through. The policy and regulatory landscape reviews, others in the room may recognise this. We thought we'll use a really slick, agile process and we'll get them done quick. You know, so we'll churn out one of these every 3 months or so. So 3 years in, we finished the last one. They're just like, reviews are just really hard sometimes, particularly when they get really complex. But anyway, we did a lot of other stuff alongside that, so it wasn't all kind of like just doing reviews. But the review process itself, we adopted something kind of interesting, we think. So basically, we were using kind of like a rapid evidence review, DEPRA methodology type approach. But what we added to that was an element of crowdsourcing. So basically, because energy is so specific, particularly energy regulation, energy policy, there's a lot of niche in there and niche information. So whilst you can do all of those systematic search terms to uncover things, there's always going to be something quite arcane or weird that only a few people know about. So what we tried to do is to push that back out and say, right, for every one of these reviews, we are really interested in points. Can you please point us towards really interesting things in this space that we wouldn't normally turn up based on your expertise? And it was quite fruitful actually doing that. So of, say, the first and second reviews, so the first one was on electric vehicles and electricity storage. The second one was on digital energy platforms. Probably about half of the things we ended up including through our inclusion criteria were crowdsourced because they were really specific, you know, and useful. So at some point we might write up kind of like that little bit of the extra methodology about why it was useful. But I just wanted to note that it was a nice addition, and I've started using crowdsourcing a lot more in other things I'm doing because I find it really useful to get that almost like a rapid prototyping or really fast feedback on things that you don't always get as an academic. The rest of the stuff is very normal kind of reviews. So basically find the stuff, screen some of it out on the basis of inclusion criteria, and then do inductive analysis to basically kind of like see what themes emerge from it and then write it up. And it always looks good on a graph like that and takes about a year in practice to do it. These are the reviews we did. There's 3 reviews here, and one of the additional thing that we did in the middle of a pandemic, you know, because everyone was doing something in the middle of a pandemic. I won't go through everything, but basically on electricity storage and electric vehicles, some of the headlines that came out was definitions really matter for certain sorts of technologies, because, you know, how you define a battery in terms of its kind of like what sort of asset it is within regulation. Is it generation? Is it demand, etc.? really matters for double charging, all sorts of other purposes. Ownership and visibility of assets matters. Can a DNO own some of these assets or not, for example? Market access and stacking value, common across energy storage. Basically, can you access all of the value that your asset could provide to the energy system? No, generally speaking. But can you access enough to make a business case for it? User-centric smart design. So a lot of these assets have been built without interoperability in mind. You know, anyone who was an early adopter of electric vehicles will have had probably some sort of nightmare with the electric charging infrastructure, with having X number of cables, X number of cards, all of that kind of stuff. Nowadays, most machines will take a tap from a credit card or a debit card. But there's also all of the things about data coming out of that, kind of like understanding kind of like where I can cite assets. You know, there's lots of things that's still missing from the system. And also, if you want to have a future where there is a very smart energy system, you need to start to bake that in now, because a lot of the assets that you're putting in place will be there for decades. You know, so you need to build in that interoperability, that open API, whatever it might be in there already. Digital energy platform, second report. Basically, the whole program that we're aligned with is a massive opportunity to learn, really big opportunity to learn and demonstrate and inform on kind of like how digital energy platforms might evolve. You know, a digital energy platform could be anything from a smart switching site through to a really smart marketplace. You know, it just depends on what it is. A lot of the distributed energy resources could be unleashed by these platforms, because a lot of them are all about maximizing the utilization of your assets, you know, kind of like put them in, make them visible to the system and allow the system to choose them more. You know, if you've got a battery in your cellar or an electric vehicle charger or a vehicle to grid assets, you know, these platforms can increase the visibility and allow you to access multiple markets. But that means you're probably going to be trusting someone with your assets. A lot of this stuff's going to be automated. So lose that trust, lose those assets is the basic gist of that one. And then there's the role of the energy system operator and distribution system operators in there. You know, they will create markets that a lot of these platforms can then access the value in. At the moment, the interoperability between markets, the visibility between markets, lots of work ongoing in that space. It's not brilliant right now. And as usual, if you were thinking about a future digital energy system, you probably wouldn't start from where we're at now. But we're going to have to go from where we're at now to something that is much more accessible, holistic, and useful across the piece. There was a middle one, which was the pandemic report, which was basically, there was a lot of things. There was, if you remember, there was a consultation on post-pandemic economic recovery. And we basically put in a paper that said, if you take a smart local energy system approach, you can basically hit net zero faster, it'll have more benefits and it's fairer. We didn't evidence it terribly well, but it sounded great. There was some evidence in there, kind of like bringing it all together, but it was one of those things where you just want it on the table, you know, to say there is a massive role for local energy in post-pandemic economic recovery, because it tends to distribute benefits more. Depends on how it's configured, but it tends to distribute benefits more fairly, it tends to keep them local, it tends to be more long-lived in many ways. And then the final one, which was the beast, was the heat report. It was going to be a heating and cooling report. We just couldn't. In the end, it's just like, it's too much. But basically, I'll come on to some of these in the barriers, but with heating in particular, we need a national strategy. That just came screaming out of the entire report. You do need to devolve more powers locally, because heat is local. You know, there's no two ways around it. Energy efficiency and heating go hand in hand, and they're local issues. And that includes some of the funding that goes alongside with the resources, the capabilities, the capacities to deliver. And you need to enable place-based energy innovation. So not a regulatory sandbox, which is specific to a license, but something where you can do energy innovation in a place that suits the values, the needs, the preferences of the people who live there. That kind of idea, something where you can do something comprehensive in a place and different to the place next door, probably. That sort of idea. Those sort of things will come back quite a lot. So I said I would not define smart local energy systems. So here is the slide on me not defining smart local energy systems. There is a reason why I'm not going to define them. The general gist, this was from a concept paper that Becky and UCL led. So smart local energy systems, funnily enough, contain smart, local and energy aspects. Just tell me if I'm going too fast, all right? But what that means is they are highly place-based. So they've got local needs, they've got local goals, they've got local resources, they've got local actors, and they've got local conditions, right? So they're already different from place to place because those things vary. They are becoming more complex with time. So you can see in projects that are local energy or smart that they're starting to combine more things together over time. So there's electricity starting to get combined with heat, starting to get combined with transport, and starting to combine some smart layer in there because you're integrating those assets, you're maximizing the utility of those assets, you're doing something that solves a more complex function. And the reason why they're undefined is because they're mostly projects at the moment. These kind of very integrated smart local energy systems are things like coming out of the Prospering from the Energy Revolution program, right? So they're trying something, you know, they're not yet scaling out or scaling up to be, you know, you can't go out and buy one necessarily today and then drop it into your situation in your local place. So that's why I'm not going to define it, because it doesn't really exist as an off-the-shelf concept, for example, at the moment. Good. Thank you, Phil. Got away with that, did I? There's also a lot of potential benefits that you can realize from smart local energy systems. So we are in the process of yet another long review that is almost finished. This one's led by Rachel Gray, which has been looking at the co-benefits of smart local energy systems, or the co-impacts, if you like. So this is the table that's going to be the heart of the paper. But basically what you've got is three sorts of benefits. So one is a set of process benefits. So how you design the process to realize the benefits. So, you know, how inclusive you are, how you address inequalities, how much you engage, how transparent you are, what is your governance and accountability. Those things will really matter about which benefits are realizable. So there's a process layer. And then there's a whole range of outcome benefits, which you will recognize. So things like financial and economic benefits, system costs, generation costs, employment, business model, innovation, all of that kind of stuff, educational benefits, skills, capabilities, knowledge exchange, learning, societal benefits, health and well-being, better air quality, for example, warmer homes, social cohesion, all of that kind of stuff. And then environmental and energy system benefits. You know, a lot of these things you'll recognize. And then there are an element of distribution of benefits, so that projects can choose how the benefits are distributed to whom. And that will depend on the configuration of the project. Is it a private project? Is it a kind of a community project? All of that kind of stuff. So you can see you've got distribution of costs of benefits, distribution of power for monopolies, local ownership models, all of that kind of thing sits in there. So there is, they're all choices. This is partly the outcomes you're seeking are almost like a menu from how you will design the process, which will in turn be dictated by the process by which you designed the smart local energy system. But then you will make a choice about how those benefits could be distributed within it. And it will vary from project to project. So that's going in for review soon. Soon, Rachel said. I reviewed it the other weekend, it looks good. So you can see, but there's a lot of other complexity in here as well. So how the scheme is configured, leadership, technology, location, objectives matter for all of those things. You know, so the kind of like the governance process behind it will matter for what benefits you end up getting and how they're distributed. But also some of these co-benefits are interlinked. So if you reduce pollution, you will increase health, which will ultimately reduce NHS costs, but not immediately. You know, there's a lag in that happening. You know, so I can reduce pollution, but I need the same amount of beds in NHS tomorrow. In the fullness of time, I might not. That kind of thing. And a smart local energy system, however it chooses to configure, its local benefits might be at the expense of the next locality. You know, so if it's got a certain set of resources and that kind of thing, it could, let's just call it, become richer at the expense of the community next door. It doesn't have that resource or the capability to do it because, you know, their energy prices are pushed up slightly for whatever reason. That kind of thing could happen, or they just dump all the pollution. You know, those things matter from place to place. Some places are better better blessed with resources, better blessed with capabilities, better blessed with whatever it might be. Stakeholders have a massive influence, significant influence on the project. So this is just running through kind of what happened in the PIFA programme. 5 years of local energy system projects, lots of investments, lots of kind of like industry kind of piling in on top of that, lots and lots of stakeholders from 60 odd projects or business-led projects. You've got 180 key stakeholders in that. One of the interesting things that I find that came out of this was a project where locally embedded stakeholders were involved was going to put equal emphasis on local benefits versus national benefits. So, not ignoring national benefits, but putting equal emphasis on it. Non-local stakeholders, large industry, whatever it might be, tends to put the emphasis on national benefits, as in scalability of the project. But what's happened in some of the longitudinal studies, it appears that where you've got more local engagement, more local stakeholders, the benefits pervade for longer. So the projects stay and deliver for a longer period of time. So they're more stable, they're more long-lived, and it's partly because of that buy-in, that local, kind of like acceptance, enthusiasm for the projects that keep them going. There might be a link to that with scalability, replicability, but it's an interesting finding. Also, these projects, because they're very integrated, the smart bit tends to mean the integrated bit. It means that there's actually new skill sets required in pulling these projects together and delivering. So it's both technical and softer skills that are needed across it, because what you're essentially doing is creating a number of subsystems within kind of like your local energy system. So you might have a community energy subsystem, energy supply sector, transport mobility. And so there are specific skills within each of those components, but then the skills that allow you to work across as a system, so kind of both skills that allow you to communicate across them, to manage across them, to realize the benefits across them, but also to translate, the kind of like what's happening here, what's happening there, to interoperate. Not sure that's a word, but you know what I mean. To kind of like have a common data, to have all of that kind of stuff. So we're going to need to think about several things in there. Firstly, having the skills and capabilities to deliver more smart local energy systems. Secondly, those skills are not evenly distributed at the moment. We know already that there are certain places that are more likely to have local energy projects, for all sorts of reasons, but also one of them is skills and resources. So we're going to need to think about the distribution of those, but we're also going to need to think about it's not just skills about the workforce, it's also the end users. Everyone is going to be part of a smart local energy system. So the assets in your home or the assets in your small business, you're part of it. You could be playing a full role in that system or allowing someone else to do it on your behalf. So it's not just skills of the people building and operating these things, it's also the skills of every single user within them, understanding kind of like what your role is in that, but also kind of like understanding how you will, if you choose to, contribute to it. And of course, if there aren't skills and skills development opportunities, particularly in certain places, then that is going to bake in injustices into the system. They're already there now. It's a very, energy is quite an unfair system, generally speaking. This could exacerbate, with the haves and have-nots, etc. And then upscaling beyond the niche is difficult for all sorts of reasons. This is a diagram that Callum Ray put together in one of the work packages on applicability, funnily enough. But it's just that idea where you do it somewhere. What is it that it needs to also have so that you can do it somewhere else? Which bits can be lifted and shifted? Which bits are going to have to be bespoke because different places are different, for various different reasons. One of the things that Callum concluded from his work that I thought was really interesting is we've got a real habit in the UK of failing to capture failure in projects and learn from it. So that idea that something inevitably will go wrong. There's something about the innovation system that says don't talk about it and don't record it, you know, so that go let other people make the same mistake. And it's not that, that's not the mentality, but there's something in the system that prohibits it. So we do not learn from mistakes and capture it, which means that the same mistakes can be made again and again and again. Community energy groups will tell you that for all sorts of reasons. You know, there's a rite of passage to go through to be in a community energy group. But it happens in industry-led projects and everything else. So there's something about failing to capture failure and learn from it. And then there are one or two barriers to smart local energy systems. These came out across all of our stuff, and you'll recognise a lot of them. But on strategy, policy and regulation, we have a very centralised decision-making process. So local is not easily recognised. There is a lack of vision. Where are we going and how we're going to get to net zero, for example, you know, across the entire economy. Very prescriptive regulation. As a supplier, you must do X, Y, and Z, and you must not do anything else, and you must answer your phone within 3 minutes or whatever it is. And there's obviously a lack of powers, resources, and capabilities at local governments, close to the heart of where a lot of these things will be delivered. There's a scalability and skills issue, which I've talked about. A lot of these projects are unique at the moment. We don't learn from mistakes. Skills varies regionally, and there's a time lag of skills development. You cannot just create kind of skills overnight. In terms of markets and businesses, there's still barriers to accessing the value from local assets. Wider benefits tend to blur traditional boundaries, you know, so energy gives a health benefit. Who's going to pay for that benefit? Or, you know, will anyone ever? The business models that people want to adopt don't fit nicely into the license structure, particularly if they cross between, say, Ofgem and Ofcom, for example. And boom and bust cycles, particularly in energy efficiency, but all across the piece, have like hampered businesses, you know, and frankly, many have given up trying to engage. And then there's a whole engagement piece as well. You know, there's a lack of a culture that supports learning about engagement. So how do you engage localities and all of the actors required? Some households could still be excluded from being part of a smart local energy system. You know, if you don't own your property, you may well be excluded if you're renting, you know, social housing, whatever it might be, or other reasons, because you don't engage in energy, full stop. You know, 50% of people have still never switched supplier. And data protection. You know, there's the cyber security issues, but there's also just the issue of trust, massive amounts of trust that are required, because open and transparent data will be the heartbeat of a lot of these systems, but someone somewhere is going to do something naughty with that, accidentally or on purpose. And how that is dealt with is going to be really critical in all of this. Anyway, I am going on. I'm going to give it 10 more minutes, then I'll finish. Maybe 5. We'll see how quickly we get through this. So, so that was a lot of gloomy stuff, actually, lots of really good learning and that kind of thing, but loads of barriers. So what we did is we designed a set of workshops to basically force the participants to come up with a top list of priority solutions to enable, basically to answer that question, what are the most important changes that can enable the implementation of smart local energy systems? So we ran 6 of these decision theatres. Like I say, it's just a fancy word. You know, you can do really high quality technical decision theatres. They use them in all sorts of things, water management, defence, whatever it might be. Put people in a model a load of stuff and take decisions. Ours is a much softer version, but you still lock people in until they take a decision. So we had 6 of these, 46 participants, 40 prioritised decisions came out of that. I'll walk you through what they told us. Again, we did a very open process to recruitment. So basically, normally I'd just do the normal thing, which is like go and contact a load of people I know because I know they'll be good in the workshop. This time we actually made it completely open and we made it an expression of interest process and just put it across as many networks as we could think of and allowed people to bring themselves forward for that. So that meant we got quite an interesting balance. I knew half the people in my workshops, which is really unusual in energy. You know, you're always going to know someone in these places, but only knowing half of them for me is really weird because that was, and it was brilliant as well. So we had a lot of participants from local authorities, from projects, from installers, from all sorts of things who just thought it might be really interesting to come and be part of this. And it was from our point of view. All of that is documented in the materials, and you'll get the slides afterwards. In terms of the approach, it looked like a typical mural kind of like online whiteboarding exercise, but basically, you know, test that everyone knows how to use the system. With what did you have for breakfast, which was interesting enough, actually. Then the way you warm up people in these workshops is basically you get them to write the most provocative statements they can about smart local energy systems. You know, so for example, a person wrote down and said, like, all local authorities should be pro smart local energy systems, and if they're not, they should be fired. You know, the staff member was, and so I'm like, right, I know we're on the right page here because we're already there. But that it gets the most important thing out of people's heads straight away. Then we get them to put down their top 3 or 4 decisions, depending on how many people we had at the workshop. Then we do a clustering exercise to basically turn that into something manageable, and then get them to vote on the top 6. That's basically the process. Obviously, the really interesting thing is why they chose those decisions, how they explained it, why they clustered in a certain way, and then how they defended the priority and how they moved it around, because they went through around the vote and go like, but my decision hasn't been chosen. And then we had to go again until it kind of like it worked, because it's a consent process, not consensus, but consent. At some point you have to stop. People start to really take decisions very quickly when there's 5 minutes left. But that's the way we went through it. So I'm not going to present all of the stuff. What I'm going to do is do 2 things really. One is present some of the problems that came out of it that we didn't ask them for, but came screaming out of the discussions. And then I'll show you the framework of decisions that came through. So the problems are quite common to what I've just told you. Kind of like, firstly, there are lots of unclear roles and responsibilities with regarding energy generally and local energy in particular. Local authorities have got a critical role, but they lack the powers, resources and capabilities. Great Britain lacks the function that plans and coordinates smart local energy systems. So everyone can go and do their own thing. And there's nothing to say, is that good nationally, for example? Or they're already doing that, you don't need to do that, that sort of thing. And the duties of distribution network operators hinder the emergence of smart local energy systems, partly because of the license, but partly because of the way they do stuff. Centralised decision making, I don't think I need to go into with this group, but it is very centralised in the UK, in GB in particular. And Ofgem's current interpretation of the duties constrain the ability to enable smart local energy systems. So they cannot discriminate, and they choose definitely not to in the most part. Community energy has been very difficult for Ofgem for years. The business case for smart local energy systems, there's a lack of long-term targeted funding. So, you know, boom and bust as well comes into that, which kind of like, you know, it just doesn't help with continuity. And the value of these smart local energy systems isn't clear. You know, it's kind of like, we know there is value in them, but can you realise it? Is it clear to the users, etc.? And then there's a whole bunch of issues around just transition. You know, the skills to deliver aren't equally distributed. The success of smart local energy systems will require some sort of behavioural change. Doesn't have to be deep, but it will have to be something. You know, if you're going to maximise the utility of all of the assets in their system, people are going to be following available energy, for example. And it could broaden inequalities. You know, you could have a real postcode lottery if kind of like certain places with the resources and capabilities really go well on smart local energy systems, and others that don't. You know, some places will get richer, some places will get poorer. That's already true today. This could broaden it, or it could introduce different ones. So this is the horrendogram we came up with at the end of it. Broadly speaking, at the top layer, you've got government, national and devolved, and Ofgem. In the middle bit, you've got a missing function, which is that regional coordinator. At the bottom, you've got local authorities, distribution network operators, and this role of smart local energy systems. And then in the blue box, even though it wasn't really in our remits, we figured there's going to be a role for the future system operator when it is created in all of this. So what I'll do is just briefly step through kind of like those, and then I'll stop. So a lot of what came out for national and devolved governments talks very strongly in a lot of those barriers I've identified. So national government should be providing a vision for future energy systems, including the role of smart local energy systems. it should legislate to change Ofgem's duties so Ofgem can understand these weird and wonderful things. It should devolve the powers, so it should reduce centralisation, and it should devolve appropriate funding, the right sort of funding to local authorities. That could be energy efficiency, it could be smart local energy systems type funding, and it should require all decisions to be evaluated against wider benefits. So start to bring in those co-benefits into government decisions rather than the very hard kind of like, green book or other approaches in general. Ofgem itself, if it's getting a new rule book from government, then that should mean it should have a much stronger focus on zero carbon. It should be adopting risk-based regulation rather than prescription regulation. It should be thinking whole systems, and it should be considering a wider set of benefits than it currently does. It's got a very limited set of things that Ofgem can take into account in decisions. The sandbox should be changed to allow smart local energy system innovation, so place-based innovation, not license by license innovation. We need to reform the supplier hub model to enable smart local energy systems, because at the moment, for most of the models, you need a supplier to play ball. And there isn't always an incentive on a supplier to be the billing and kind of like other agent in this system. Market reform is needed to ensure that this value flows. Obviously, we've got the REMA, so review of electricity market arrangements process going on at the moment. That could take a while, but it's important, but it's very centralised in its thinking once again. And we need to evolve consumer protection for smart local energy systems without knowing exactly what that means. So you have to have some sort of agile, risk-based approach to this. In terms of the local box, local authorities, as we've seen, get a flow down, so they're mandated and resourced to deliver net zero. That's really important. And required to undertake local area energy planning, not necessarily the process that Energy System Catapult have developed, but something along that lines, maybe something with a bit more people focus in it, for example. They're required to be that agent of engagement, informed, coordination, transparency, governance around the local actors and communities that will be involved in delivery, and the DNO, distribution network operator, coordinate and disperse the funding that's coming down to them, and also develop those skills and capabilities to deliver smart local energy systems. The distribution network operator, really important. They need to be much more attuned with enabling smart local energy systems and providing data so that you can drive whole systems innovation, and valuing flexibility in local markets and coordinating with the local authorities and other parties like the other DNOs, the FSO, so that you can have kind of like a holistic view of markets, a holistic view of kind of like needs and network, so that you can actually have coordinated, do the right thing once in the system from a whole systems point of view. And then SLES in the middle of that is basically delivering net zero energy locally, delivering value and wider benefits, and coordinating with all of these actors. It's the kind of like thing, whatever it is, again, it's in there doing it. Everything else is creating the conditions so it can, enabling it, it's doing it. And then you need something, a regional coordinator of some form, that's going to make sure that everything adds up and that you're not having kind of like A and B doing something that's cancelling each other out, or all of those crazy things that might happen if you just did it from the bottom up. It doesn't mean controlling, it just means saying, did you know that? But there's a role in there in terms of planning, not just energy planning, but kind of spatial planning, investment, zoning, heat zoning, other sorts of zoning, licensing, within that. It's kind of like there's something missing at the moment in the system. And Ofgem said the same in their institutions and governance consultation as well. But they didn't say it. They said, here's a model that could evolve a regional coordinator, but they said it's missing at the moment. And then the FSO's going to be really important in all of this as well. Again, at the moment, the FSO looks like it could be a very centralized view of the energy system. So it's either going to have to take a lot of information from the smart local energy system so that it can run the whole system, or it's going to have to relinquish a lot of power down and functions down to distribution system operators or whatever's operating down there. because that's where the action is in some ways. Obviously, with 50 gigawatts of offshore wind, there's still going to be quite a big role for a national transmission system. So that was it. That was basically what we got from that. So you can see national government evolve, resources and capabilities down locally. There was a little bit of argument of whether it should be a local authority or not, by the way. You need this new regional coordinator. You need to mandate open energy data and transparency, because that's going to be the thing that lubricates all of this and tells you what the right thing to do where is. And we need to really think about the wider benefits of local energy, you know, so that we maximize kind of like the potential of what you could get out of local energy, and it can also be specific to the place, you know, because there might be different benefits and you can choose what they are, but they're all valued somewhere. That is it. Yeah, because I'm going to do the policy route map next, but I haven't done it yet. Good.
Thank you.
Thank you all for listening.
I'll open the floor to questions in a moment. My first question, though, is trust. You did mention that. So local authorities still have relatively high level of trust from the local population. My concern is even if there is a whole, which is a regional energy coordinator, that doesn't come with the trust built in. So what thinking has there been about the need for there to be trust, and that in position of a body to coordinate things maybe doesn't bring the right connotations? So has that been workshopped?
It's a good question, actually. So I think a lot of the trust about those local energy issues are always going to be local. So because that's the right, it's the right place and scale to figure out what the right thing to do is. So this coordinating body isn't, participants and I don't see it as something that's reaching down and saying, don't do that, you're not having that. It's more saying, right, at a regional scale, we're short on this, we're long on this, we're kind of like too wide on this, we're too narrow on that. What else can we do within the constraints of the social contract you've arranged locally? Because I think that's going to be a lot of this stuff is really about that great engagement that says, all right, we, the people of this place, get it, and we know where we're going. We've got a vision now. We're prepared to do this in return for you promising to deliver that. There's a lot of that going on. So we know what our role is. We know what their role is locally. If you get another body coming in and saying, I'll stop it now, that's not going to work. So it's got to be more about kind of, you'll still need that. Does this all add up to a good outcome across GB? That's still going to be really important. But how that does that will be probably more by influence, coordination, softer power. I don't imagine it's going to be a body that just goes like, you know, okay, Yorkshire, less of that in the north, more of that in the south, because that's just going to end up in a horror show.
I'm going to sneakily ask the question, are the devolved administrations actually performing some of that function already?
Well, arguably, yes. So in Scotland, clearly, there is now much more of a mandate on local energy plans. There's much more of a mandate on kind of like figuring out your energy efficiency strategies, which means they are taking a holistic view. And arguably as well, it's about the right size to be able to look across all of that. You know, there's plenty of people up in Scotland, but it's, you know, as a regional thing, it's a slightly more manageable size than the whole of England, for example. But and Wales, to some extent, they're already putting in place a local area energy planning. They're thinking about having some sort of system architect in Wales. I was involved in something with the Deputy Climate Minister, which was concluding in that direction, that you need something that kind of like takes all the bits and sees what it adds up to. Whether that's a coordination role or not, don't know. It might just say, if we're going to have that, we're going to need more of these lines and that sort of thing. So there's bits of that coming through. Again, is it a size and scale thing? It's on next space when I said the right size, so I want to come back on that. Well, I do, yeah. Well, yes. So and I think this is what we're going to get into, isn't it? It's kind of like what's the right size to kind of like to coordinate across so it's big enough so it's enough kind of like, I don't know, percentage of the energy mix, whatever it might be, demand, something like that. Thoughts? I'm really interested in that actually, because it didn't come out. It didn't say what was the right size for a regional coordinator.
To me, that is such a question. The whole, I mean, the reason I give you the thumbs up for not defining SLES is that that's not the square link. One of my biggest faults is patience. The number of talks I've seen about what is smart, what is local, what is energy, and what is a system. I don't know how many million we're spending on just the those terms. And I wonder part of the problem is that that's means at the end. Normally, is a good research question. What's the right scale? All sorts of different solutions. All in once, so it has to be a local system for local people. It can only be within these boundaries. I mean, that's totally arbitrary, not a sensible approach. It's not random.
Yeah, no, it's kind of, no, I think that's going to be really interesting because lots of people are independently coming to the same conclusion. We've got missing functions in the UK. You know, of course, some institutions that tell you, no, I could do it. You know, but whether they're equipped to do not, I don't know. Nick.
Yeah, just one local authority do not, I'm not warning. Birmingham is not the job, it's the council, and then there will always similar in that sense in terms of recognizing mobility. To do things. The second is this question for all, which is particularly relevant in a place like this where we've already got 2 tiers, neither of which agrees with the government. So you haven't answered the question for us. Is this Oxford City Council or Oxford County Council? I expect a lot of it. That's the thing used to, but still. The issue that's linked to that is urban rural, right? So if you look at the plans for net zero in both Leeds and Cambridge, they assume that they will get zero carbon electricity from outside their geographic boundary. But actually, if you're an urban area, you can't make any other assumption. That it's just because you can't generate it all in your own area. So when we talk about, say, the West Midlands, Yorkshire, South Yorkshire, there's a chance in hell of them generating on their own energy. So, what does an area plan look like? Because of it, well, you could choose a rural area, and this is beginning to happen in the this was Oxfordshire, where we're essentially saying to them, we've got to generate then the energy that you building up, whatever it is, 800 megawatt solar farm in West Oxfordshire. And that has a lot of implications and trust issues probably.
Yeah, and I think those are great research questions as well. And I think that's so what I think if we had a view on what local energy plans looked like, that's incredibly useful information for starting to kind of like to look at that and go like, well, that doesn't add up. You know, it's kind of like there's not enough generation being cited, or kind of everyone's assuming that someone else is going to generate. That's really important, but we don't have that information at the moment. We know it implicitly. I think we know it's true that some places are going to host more generation than others, and it will be an urban-rural divide. But we don't have that yet. So it's like that is a fabulous, you know, what a great bit of data that would be for research to start. What's many stones that would like uncover the kind of like the horrors beneath. Having that information, that's where a regional type approach. But I think the question of what does that look like from region to region, you know, is it Yorkshire, or is it DNO boundaries, or is it something else, you know, kind of like political boundaries, whatever it might be, that's unanswered at the moment. But it, you know, do you do it as a purely selfish, like natural kind of like, I don't know, energy constraints regional plan? You know, you just base it on the grid structure and kind of like work it through that, because, you know, certain institutions might want to do
You
that.
mean electricity grid, you know, when we mentioned the word gas involved.
No, you're right, I
Right,
didn't.
practice, like, well, most of our energy.
Yeah, and so grids,
But you're already seeing that in the Tees Valley area where you're looking at hydrogen-based transport. So does the boundary stop where the bus can't refuel, or you know? It's,
yeah, you know, it's a regional decision around Wilton or something like that, to kind of like have a hydrogen system. So it's these are good. Like, let's keep questions coming. So I want this to be a discussion in the group as well. So I want you to react to all of this stuff, which you are doing.
I'm not sure whether this is a question or a suggestion actually, but in terms of trying to perform all these classifications, I wonder if it's worth thinking about it in terms of where do you think the weight of the assets are? And you know, when I think about this, I think, well, actually, there are three levels. There are three levels of centralisation, decentralisation. First one is the individual. And for the individual, if you own an EV, that's your asset, you control how you use it. And the same possibly with the heat pump. If you move up to local heat networks, it's obviously, well, an undefined, we call it the local authority, we think of city. And then, you know, above that, obviously, you've got the grid and so, and in the middle, you've got sort of generation access. But the question I had sort of came out of this was, it always seems to me that the really important question in all this is going to be, what's the relationship between the decentralized unit and the next one up? You know, what do you think are the key things to get right? You know, and I have my own business, which is basically it's about tariffs. You know, it's about how you pay for the interchanges. So,
Yeah. So one of the things that I think is going to be really important, if we want the system which really does use all the resources and assets available to it, what it's going to have is from the smallest asset in the system, something in a home, whatever it might be, to the largest asset in the system, whatever that will be in the future. It might be a nuclear power station, it might be something else, it might be gas grid, whatever it might be. They all have to have the same visibility. You know, they have to be findable. They have to be, you know, kind of like visible system. They all have to be able to interact, broadly speaking, on the same terms. You know, you're not going to have a hundreds of megawatt gas plant versus a kind of like I've got a 4 kilowatt hour battery. You know, I'm not going to perform exactly the same function, but you still need the same interoperability between it. You know, so that you can all get into the same markets in the same way, rather than kind of like having to design kind of like a market entry for device class A versus B versus C and all that kind of thing. So you need like that fractal kind of thing. So no matter how far down the system you go, it's got a similar visibility, similar experience, similar interoperability, similar ability to play. You know, because obviously a swarm of my batteries is the same as a gas-fired power station for the 2 hours that they can go for. You know, it's that kind of idea, which we don't have at the moment. We don't design around, you know, we still have a very asset class based kind of interaction with the system. And then there's the thing that I think we miss massively in GB generally is a really clear view on outcomes. What are we trying to achieve? You know, all right, we've got net zero, great. And what? Which will tell you a lot about how. You know, what other things do you want from that? Do you want it to be a just transition? Do you want it to be environmentally better? Do you want it to be greater service quality for end users? Whatever it might be. You know, we've had lots of engagement processes that have tried to get to the heart of it. You know, citizens' assemblies, local assemblies, all sorts of kind of like surveys and all that kind of thing. We've learned loads of useful stuff. There's a great Nick Pigeon UK paper that kind of like showed that people know roughly what they want out. They're going to pay for net zero, which we are. They know what they want on the flip side of it. It's all of those things, like kind of like just and fair and better in many ways. But somehow we just keep missing it. You know, every time we go to like, here's a great net zero target, let's go. And it's got like, let's go with what positive vision of the future that encapsulates that we can all get behind. And we haven't got that. which is why it's a hell of a lot easier to do that locally. You know, it's kind of like, it's easier to have that kind of like really good conversation with trusted actors involved in it, to kind of like to have that thing in the places that have got the resources to do it, which still gets us back to the fairness and distribution issues. So it's I don't want to stick to this road, so I'm going to like not come to you, Phil. I'm going to go yeah, here, and then I'll come back.
Complicated, isn't it? I mean, I'm involved in one of the people projects, the energy of Oxford, and actually that's a bit simple because it's really three separate things pretending to be one thing. Didn't say that. Right, so you know, it's not really complicated like Project Leo, which is trying to do a very, very complex set of governance and sort of arrangements between all sorts of different stakeholders. And sometimes I think, you know, it's all local, that sounds like a nice word, and then people start talking about stacking values and this and that and all these different relationships. It's a highly complex system, which most of us can't understand, let alone get involved in. And I wonder if sometimes the word local is a bit of a, you know, panacea and all that sounds nice and cuddly, whereas natural facts, maybe this isn't cuddly at all, and it's some very complex set of commercial relationships that might not end up being any better by having a sort of top down, this is how it's going to be, this is what we're doing. So I'd just like to push you a bit on, do you think this is going to be better in some of those sort of, in some ways that are real, not just it sounds nice?
Yeah, well, that's getting right at the heart of it, isn't it? Because I'm with you, actually. It's kind of like a lot of the things you end up having to do to realise quite a simple vision, you know, to just kind of, I don't know, use local assets or something like that, ends up just painfully complicated and horrendous in many ways once you try and work it through the system you've got before you. Kind of like, oh, it's like yeah, you can do it, but you can do this and that. It's kind of, you know, I've seen people almost die in meetings with Alexa. You know, they're balancing a settlement codes where they're kind of like, you know, said like, oh yeah, you can do it, and then they get out a spreadsheet, and then they take you through the lines that you're going to have to do and the tortuous way you're going to end up doing it. I had a diagram, and I haven't done it in this one, but basically it's the idea that there's a myriad of ideas that people want to do in energy, represented by different animals like an owl and a badger and all that kind of stuff. And they go through this funnel of the rules and regulations, and they all come out dogs at the bottom, because it's the only thing you can do. You've been through all of that prescription, you've been through all of those rules and regulations, you've been through all of the industry codes, and it's just kind of like, oh yeah, I have to bill like this, and I have to do it like this, and it can be quite painful. So that's not very hopeful. So the hope side of it is, I think you can, by engaging locally and having some sort of vision about where you want to go locally, if we can also tie that to kind of like having a regulatory system that allows more place-based innovation without heaping prescription on it and without kind of like tying it to a particular licensed entity or something like that. So basically says, in Oxford or a bit of Oxfordshire, what do you want to do? Tell us, you know, the kind of boundaries of that. We'll let you do it. You have to show us what you're doing as you go on. You have to share and be really open and transparent about it. So we as a regulator can learn from that, because we don't know what customer harm looks like in what you're doing, but the data we'll get from it will tell us, you know, something really useful. So I've written papers with Laura Sandys about more anticipated regulation. I think that's where we need to go, more risk-based regulation, more anticipated regulation, where regulation can be part of the innovation process, can learn from it. Again, coming back to learning from failure or just learning, full stop of innovation. We've got to get better at it. And I think local is a natural size and scale for experimentation, because you're doing something that is kind of like to meet local needs, preferences, values, all of that kind of stuff. But it's torturous at the moment to try and do that innovation in the system we're in.
We don't even know what the means in Consortium. Is that local? You know, Scotland. I mean, that's.
I don't know. It comes back to Nick's question, doesn't it? It's kind of like, where do you draw the boundaries? What's a sense? And again, that's
A lot of community goes to certain smaller than that.
But Nick, even them, they may be split by having 2 supply points on the electricity network, and they're told they can't treat their supply as being the same, even though they're in the same community.
yeah. So keep this theme going. So, well, I'm not getting anywhere, but I think we will collectively. There was a question at that.
I just say the role of the local universities, that could be sort of gravitational point for it. Is giving those universities that have a capability in, say, renewable energy or low carbon emissions that acts in the social way in their area to feed into this system function. And then also have that trust as well. So yeah, just thinking about their role.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's really important. I think the question back to the I'm not supposed to do this, so supposed to answer your question, but there's a question back to the room. Is it easy as a university to fulfill that one? You know, are there, you know, do we have kind of like the innovation mechanisms in place, the kind of the way funding works and all? So what I hear as a horror story from the people program is that, you know, on day one of a 4-year program, you had to put in place every single one of your deliverables for the next 4 years. And there was very limited flexibility to kind of like change course when you learn something, for example. Now, Innovate UK knows this, like the whole program knows it, but it was still there. So you have all these stage gates and kind of like horrible, critical, stressing periods and all that kind of stuff. So, you know, which is not ideal for a university to kind of like to do a role which is kind of like, that's really interesting, let's follow that one, you know, because you can't always do that. So there's something also about the innovation system, you know, not only do we fail to learn from failure, but there's something about setting up innovation in too prescriptive a way, so it cannot be a very good learning environment. So that's a much wider point than what you were making, but it's just something I keep hearing when I talk about not just this program, lots of other innovation programs as well. And there's also, not to extend this point too far, there's also a movement in large energy innovation programs to go through this kind of discovery alpha beta phase, which is really good for kind of like getting testing and failing, you know, failing fast with ideas. That's brilliant. But if you want to get academics involved in it, like a 2-month project, you won't have a contract signed until 8 months after that. You know, so it's kind of like, how is that? How can universities kind of like adapt kind of like research practice to become much more agile in many ways and allow a bit of flexible resource somewhere, you know, not fill people up to 118% of their kind of FTE or whatever it might be. So that there's a lot of other things kind of entrained in this.
Find the answer, Jack. Can you tell us?
Yeah, yeah,
Maybe the whole university system.
yeah, yeah. I'm not close to it yet as an answer. There was a question here.
Going back to your slide about the benefits that you presented. So one bit, yes, it needs to be contextual, it needs to be place-based, but in terms of my responsibility as a policymaker or regulator, how do you juxtapose that contextuality with something like provisioning, something like universal basic energy, and yeah, how, because that would then, so this would then become a second order, whereas that becomes a more fundamental thing that I need to provide to the community, the users.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point, because, you know, energy is an essential service, so it's always going to be heavily regulated, and it's always going to be kind of like politically important for lots of reasons. There is yet another really interesting academic question, I think, in this, which is what does energy as an essential service mean in a zero carbon energy system? You know, so most zero carbon energy systems are going to be quite renewables led. They will have multiple vectors for how they deliver heat and transport and multiple means, some of which are very local, some of which are very national, like offshore wind in the UK, that kind of thing. But what they have at their heart is turning the conventional logic on its head from being supply following demand to demand following supply. That's how you build the smallest system possible. Which, you know, this winter is going to be a really interesting example of that, right? Because we know it's going to be tight. There are a lot of conditions through all of the interconnectors where there's all sorts of things going on. France is having real trouble getting nuclear reactors online, all of that kind of thing. It's going to be really tight this winter. So we're going to find out quite a lot about how essential for all users is energy. Because there's a really, if conditions are in a certain way, there will be some users disconnected for periods of time and that kind of thing. So when I was in Ofgem, this is not answering your question at all. I'm going to get there. I might get there, but you can come back to me and kind of like, if I've got anywhere close to it. When I was in Ofgem, I asked the question, universal service, what does that actually mean? So if I chose to, could I set my own reliability standards? So could I say, I want energy from the grid 8% of the time, I'll sort myself out the other 20% of the time. Could I do that? And our colleagues were just kind of like, why would anyone do that? But it's kind of like, it's that thing. It's like in the future, there is going to be lots of different ways in which we could design the energy system, energy markets, and the nature of the essential service. What we're not doing is having a conversation about any of them, really, at a policy level. Which, if there was some flexibility in what essential service meant, which meant, I don't know, in a locality, you might say, kind of like, grid becomes an insurance policy, which we will pay for, but 90% of the time we're going to be self-reliant on what we produce locally, or 20% of the time, depending on what resource we've got and all that kind of thing. It's not really a thing you can articulate at the moment within the rules. But it's so I definitely haven't answered your question, but I think it's a very good question, which is why, and I don't know how to answer it, but bring it into the wider discussion here.
Yeah, can I pick up on your point about reliability? I think that's absolutely right. And I mean, I think a guy called Andrew Wright at Ofgem did raise it a few years ago.
Yeah.
I think he got pilloried in the Daily Mail for that reason. But when you think about it, when you think about what's possible within the sort of digital world in which we now live, you can choose a different standard of reliability for different parts of your electricity take, for example. You want your laptop to be serviceable 100% of the time, to be in your basic lighting and stuff. For EV, you don't care that much, actually, even if you can't charge it for a week. You can take the bus to work for a change, or work at home, or whatever. It's not the same level of security that's required.
And just to interject, John, there's also the priority services register that recognises some users have a more urgent need to have attention if there's a problem. So already there's a tier kind of system.
Laura Sandys she always frames things so beautifully. One of the things that she did was she said, why do we talk about security of supply? Why don't we talk about security of service? Which is really what you're getting at, because some of your services matter more. It can be a dangerous thing to get into, because you can end up, again, starting to push the complexity down to end users who are making not very well informed decisions because it's too damn complicated. So there's got to be some balance in here. But a debate, I think, is, so one of the, Laura and I put a provocation on LinkedIn, which was basically saying, well, what would happen if you had your universal service was a guaranteed connection at a fixed capacity, to every home, to every business, and so forth. And what you're doing is basically, because you can then size the grid accordingly to that minimum standard, you can then kind of like, your future costs are reasonably well known. And you can basically do quite a good pass-through mechanism for that. Every unit of electricity you consume within that capacity limit, like a broadband model, really, how fast you want your download speed. If you're adding additional devices that will require a capacity increase, you pay the fully reflected cost of that additional capacity. So kind of like, so that will incentivize you to realise those additional services at the minimum capacity, and it could incentivize capacity trading. Horribly complicated. So it's just a provocation out there, but thinking about kind of like, how do you do it? So that loads of other models, big shake of the head.
Right. You just pile it onto heater, which is, we know is the thing.
I'm going to suggest that we continue the conversation a minute and just say I'm really pleased to hear, Jeff, that 120 million quid didn't just answer no, and you've got some more. Thanks very much indeed, Jeff. Okay. quick note about next week. I'm going to show people in the room as well by the magic of this thing. The last seminar of this term, John Barrett's postponing till January. I think he's having an OBE given to him or something, so we'll allow him on that. But yeah, next week we have Ellen Gosden from Arup, who's coming to talk about retrofit at scale, a challenge. I know we've heard about that topic a number of times, but this is feeding into a potential follow-up programme to the local Energy Oxfordshire project. So that promises to be very exciting. But thanks very much to everyone who joined us online. Have a good evening.